In the beginning, the great concern of the Habsburgs in the Christian world was to guarantee their dominion and status before other families of the Holy Roman Empire. After the coronation of Frederick III in 1452, they managed to maintain the title of Holy Roman Emperor practically continuously until the dissolution of this institution in 1806. With their position secured, they accomplished greater achievements. With the creation of the Spanish dynastic line, the concerns became to fight France and to reconvert the Protestant princes of northern Germany. The dream of a universal monarchy, aligned with the family spirit of predestination, died in the face of the connection between these two rivals. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, the last religious conflict in Central Europe, also marked the limitation of the family's ambitions, which would only fight to maintain its possessions until the beginning of the 19th century. But the Peace of Westphalia, the end of the war, established the limits of imperial power. The empire was increasingly dominated by territorial princes, and the efforts of the Habsburgs to turn it into a structured monarchy failed. In the 17th century, the Habsburgs found an opponent capable of facing the universal monarchy, Louis XIV, the Sun King, and a dynasty at their height, the Bourbons. To face this rival, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor at the time, emphasized in each of his images the royal symbols such as insignia, crowns, coat of arms, and scepters, usually positioning himself in the middle of his ancestors. This emphasized the image of continuity, tradition, and above all, the splendor and glory of his reign around his family. Leopold fought 3 times against France: the Franco-Dutch War, the 9-Year War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. In the latter, Leopold wanted to give his youngest son all of Spain's heritage, ignoring the will of the late Charles II, who wanted Louis XIV's grandson to take the throne. In the end, he assumed the crown as Prince Philip V. Leopold started a war that ravaged much of Europe. The first years of the war were reasonably good for Austria, but it lasted until 1714, 9 years after Leopold's death, something that had little effect on nations at war. When peace returned, it was not clear that Austria could emerge as triumphant as in the war against the Turks. With the death of Leopold I in 1705, his eldest son assumed the throne as Joseph I. Joseph continued the War of the Spanish Succession, which had been done in his father's reign against King Louis XIV of France. He tried unsuccessfully to place his brother Archduke Charles as the King of Spain. Even so, he succeeded in establishing Austrian rule over the Italian peninsula thanks to the military victories of Prince Eugene of Savoy. His only male son died from hydrocephalus before his first birthday. The dynastic succession was threatened because he had only 2 daughters, and his wife became sterile after contracting syphilis from her husband. Her father, who was still alive during these events, had Joseph and his brother Charles sign the mutual pact of succession, ensuring that Joseph's daughters would have absolute precedence over Charles's daughters, none of whom were born at the time, and that Mary Josepha would inherit the kingdom. Joseph I died suddenly in 1711. His brother assumed the throne as Charles VI. Having only 2 daughters and no male heirs, he carefully prepared the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, declaring that his kingdom could not be divided, and the female daughters could also inherit the paternal throne. His death triggered the Austrian War of Succession. Finally, the Pragmatic Sanction prevailed, and his daughter Maria Theresa succeeded him as Queen of Hungary, Bohemia, and Archduke of Austria. But being a woman, she was not elected to the Holy Roman Empire, a position that was assumed by Charles VII. After Charles VII, Maria Theresa's husband, Francis III, Duke of Lorraine, was elected emperor as Francis I, ensuring the continuation of the Habsburg line. The dynasty flourished again under the command of Maria Theresa, 1717 to 1780. It was the time of the cultural apogee of the Austrian monarchy. Her rule corresponded to the flourishing of Central European culture, with Italian, Slavic, and Magyar contributions. The unity of the empire was ensured by the German language and centralization of power. The marriage of Archduke Maria Theresa to Francis of Lorraine gave rise to the new Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. Maria Theresa elected her husband as Holy Roman Emperor in 1745 as Francis I. Her reign was one of the most brilliant. She strengthened the central administration, delegating the management of finances to a central directory. She created a state council, ministerial departments, and a unified chancellery for Austria and Bohemia, reform of the Kaunitz-Rheinberg Prince in 1761-1762, Maria Theresa centralizing policy advocates. The 7 Years' War shook the Habsburg Empire again. In 1756, Austria reconciled with its hereditary enemy, France, and together they fought the power of Prussia over Silesia. The alliance was the beginning of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. A coalition was established between Austria, France, Poland, Sweden, and Russia against Prussia. But the victories of King Frederick II and the defection of the Russians would force Maria Theresa to sign the Habsburg Peace in 1763. Prussia, with 1/3 of the wealth and 1/6 of the population of Austria, won 2 major victories. The double shock led to 2 sudden outbreaks of reform in the Habsburg state during Maria Theresa's reign to modernize and renew the entire government apparatus. For the first time, the aristocracy and clergy had to pay taxes. The empress had 16 children. She prepared her eldest son to rule and govern by his side. As far as possible, she married her daughters to European monarchs. The eldest son was Joseph, an enlightened absolutist who, like his mother, wanted to transform the dispersed territories of the Habsburg monarchy into a properly administered state. The youngest daughter was Marie Antoinette. When Maria Theresa sent her daughter to marry the crown prince of the French crown in 1773, this was considered a typical example of Habsburg marital diplomacy. It was the union of 2 dynastic families that had been rivals in the past. Maria Theresa ruled for 40 years, dying in 1780 at the age of 63. She was the first and only woman to rule the Habsburg domains and the last head of the House of Habsburg. From her marriage, the royal house was renamed the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. The throne was assumed by the emperor's eldest son, Joseph II. Under his leadership, the reforms in the empire were deeper. The Enlightenment ideas were the dominant ones at the time. He implemented religious freedom, dissolved the lands that were church property, and took control of the universities. An advanced penal code was introduced. Courts were reformed, and censorship was abolished. Mandatory conscription was inaugurated, and the army expanded to approximately 300,000 soldiers. Servitude was formally abolished in 1781, among other comprehensive reforms. But externally, Joseph II was a failure. He tried to conquer Bavaria, but was barred by Russia. He tried to conquer the Balkans, but was barred by the Ottoman Turks. The reign of Joseph II ended in failure and disappointment. With the death of Joseph II and the rise of Leopold II, much of the implemented reforms were eventually repealed. And with the French Revolution, the dynasty and aristocracy came together to implement conservative measures. Even censorship returned. The French Revolution, with the beheading of King Louis XVI and his Austrian wife, proved to be a much more serious enemy than the splendor of the Sun King. The avalanche produced by the motto Liberté, Égalité, and Fraternité, and the victories of Napoleon Bonaparte almost destroyed the Habsburgs. At that time, the commander of the empire was Francis I. As the leader of the great and multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire, Francis, known as Francis II in the Holy Roman Empire, felt threatened by Napoleon Bonaparte's social and political reforms, which were being exported all over Europe with the expansion of the First French Empire. Francis had a fragile relationship with France. His aunt, Marie Antoinette, wife of Louis XVI, was guillotined by the revolutionaries at the beginning of his reign. Francis, in general, was indifferent. She was not very close to her father Leopold, and although Francis had known her, he was too young at the time to have any recollection of her. Georges d'Aton tried to negotiate the emperor the liberation of Marie Antoinette, but Francis was not willing to make concessions. Later, he led Austria in the French Revolutionary Wars. He briefly commanded the Allied forces during the Flanders Campaign of 1794, before handing over the command to his brother Charles, Duke of Teschen. Later, he was defeated by Napoleon. It was the beginning of a parish. Once again, he fought against France during the Second and Third Coalitions, was defeated, delacerated, and humiliated at the Battle of Austerlitz. Thus he signed the Treaty of Pressburg, weakening the Austrian Empire and reorganizing Germany under the Confederation of the Rhine, headed by Napoleon. After this, he believed that his position as Holy Roman Emperor had become untenable. On August 6, 1806, he abdicated from the throne. He was the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and the first emperor of the Austrian Empire. In 1809, Francis attacked France again, hoping to take advantage of the Peninsular War. He was defeated once more. He was forced to ally himself with Napoleon, gave up territory of his empire, joined the Continental Blockade, and accepted that his daughter Marie-Louise marry Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars drastically weakened Austria and threatened its domination among the states of Germany, a position that it would end up yielding to the Kingdom of Prussia. However, with Napoleon's defeats in Leipzig and Waterloo and the Congress of Vienna, the Emperor of Austria again emerged as one of the most powerful in Europe. In recognition of this, Francis, represented by Metternich, presided over the Congress of Vienna, helping to redesign the political map of Europe, ushering in a conservative era. The German Confederation, a weak association of Central European states, was created by the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to organize the surviving states of the Holy Roman Empire. The Congress was a personal triumph for Francis. With the death of Francis, his eldest son Ferdinand ascended to the throne in 1835. Ferdinand had a mental illness since childhood and was unable to govern his empire. A regential council was established after his ascension. As a consequence of the 1848 revolutions, Ferdinand abdicated in December of that year in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph I. Ferdinand moved to the Prague castle until his death at the age of 82 in 1875. Franz Joseph I restored order to the empire and Austria's dominance in the Germanic Confederation. His reign, which lasted 68 years, is the fourth longest in European history after Louis XIV of France, Johann II of Liechtenstein, and Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom. It is the second most famous monarch in the 19th century Europe, only behind Napoleon. His wife was the famous Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Empress Sisi. During his reign, the focus of tensions changed. Instead of the nearly 300-year rivalry with France, the 19th century was marked by the dispute with Prussia for supremacy in the rest of Germany. More industrialized, culturally unified, and with a much better equipped and trained army, Prussia defeated any Austrian ambition. Austria lost its territories in northern Italy to Piedmont, which would unify the region a few years later, gave up its influence in the rest of Germany, and capitulated before the Hungarians who claimed more autonomy. This gave rise to the dual monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The powerful empire became a secondary power. The Balkans was its only route of expansion, and it was precisely in that region that the First World War broke out. Franz Joseph's heir was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On June the 22nd of 1914, the Archduke was killed in an attack in Sarajevo, in the newly annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. Persuaded by one of his ministers, Franz Joseph I gave an ultimatum to the Kingdom of Serbia. Although Serbia agreed to most of the points of the ultimatum, war was declared on Serbia in 1914, triggering the First World War. The First World War put an end to any restructuring project. Without withstanding the internal pressures of the most varied underrepresented ethnic groups, Slavs, Czechs, and Italians, for example, and the technologically backward, the empire collapsed in the conflict and was torn apart by the victorious powers after the war ended. The creation of the Democratic Republic of Hungary and the Germanic Republic of Austria led to the formal deposition of the Habsburgs. After some failed attempts to regain the throne, the family went into exile in Switzerland. Charles I, the last emperor, never formally abdicated. However, the Habsburg law, passed by the Austrian parliament, confiscated the family's property and political rights. When we look at the past, this family stands out for its great matrimonial agreements. It came to form an empire where the sun never set. It was the central character of some of the greatest events in history and kept his family dynasty cohesive. The dream of a universal Christian monarchy did not come true, but the Habsburg Empire is in history.